Everyone in Fairmont, West Virginia, thought Margaret Cashwell simply left town. A 42-year-old spinster with no family ties, she'd talked about moving to Florida for years. When she vanished 3 days before Christmas 1968, most folks figured she'd finally done it. The police searched for 2 months, found nothing, and eventually let the case go cold. But Margaret hadn't left town. And 31 years later, an insurance auditor sitting in an office 300 miles away would accidentally discover exactly where she'd gone. What that discovery revealed would prove that sometimes the most brutal crimes are committed not in dark alleys, but in the bright fluorescent light of a trusted workplace. If you want to hear more cases like this one, subscribe to Greg's Cold Files. December 20th, 1968 started like any other Friday at the Monongahela Coal Company headquarters in Fairmont. Margaret Cashwell arrived at her desk at exactly 7:45 in the morning, same as she had every workday for the past 14 years. She hung her navy wool coat on the wooden rack by her office door, set her brown leather purse in the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet, and began reviewing the payroll ledgers that would determine everyone's Christmas bonuses. At 42 years old, Margaret had built a life that looked successful from the outside. She was the company's senior accountant, one of only 3 women who'd managed to climb into management positions at Monongahela Coal. It wasn't an easy achievement in 1968, especially not in West Virginia's male-dominated coal industry. But Margaret had earned her position through sheer competence. She knew every dollar that flowed through the company, could spot a discrepancy in the books from across a room, and had never missed a single day of work in all her years there. What people didn't see was how empty her house felt when she returned home each evening. How she'd stopped accepting dinner invitations from her cousin Louise because watching happy families around the table made her chest ache. How she'd stand at her bedroom window some nights, watching the neighbors' children play in their yards, wondering what it would feel like to hear a child call her mother. Margaret had made peace with spinsterhood years ago, or so she'd told herself. Women like her, women who chose careers over marriage in the 1950s, had to accept certain sacrifices. But lately, something had shifted inside her. Maybe it was turning 40. Maybe it was watching her co-workers' children graduate from high school and start families of their own. Whatever the reason, Margaret had started to feel the weight of all the things she'd never have. The Monongahela Coal Company wasn't the biggest operation in West Virginia, but it was substantial. The company employed 360 workers across 4 mines in Marion County. The headquarters building sat on the edge of downtown Fairmont, a 3-story brick structure that had been built in 1923. Margaret's office was on the 2nd floor, directly across from her supervisor, Robert Hills. Robert Hills had been the company's chief financial officer for 6 years. He was 51 years old, married with 2 grown children, and widely respected in Fairmont's business community. He'd hired Margaret back in 1954, recognizing her talent with numbers, even though many of the other executives had balked at bringing a woman into such a senior position. Their affair had started innocently enough in 1962. Late nights, working on quarterly reports. Conversations that stretched beyond business into personal territory. Robert had been the first person to really see Margaret, not just as a competent accountant, but as a woman with dreams and fears and desires. He'd told her she was brilliant. He'd made her laugh. And when he'd first kissed her one evening after everyone else had gone home, Margaret had felt something she'd thought was lost to her forever. She knew it was wrong. He was married, he had a family. But for 6 years, their relationship had been the most important thing in Margaret's life. They were careful. They never met outside of work. They never called each other at home. But twice a week, sometimes 3 times, Robert would stay late at the office and Margaret would join him. They'd talk about everything. He'd hold her. For those stolen hours, Margaret felt less alone. She'd never asked him to leave his wife, She'd accepted the boundaries of what they had. But then, in October, everything changed. Margaret had missed her monthly cycle. At first, she'd thought it was menopause starting early. She was 42, after all. But when it happened again in November, she'd gone to see a doctor in Clarksburg, 30 miles away, where nobody knew her. The doctor confirmed what she'd barely allowed herself to hope. She was pregnant, 12 weeks along. At her age, with no husband, it was a scandal waiting to happen. But Margaret had felt something unexpected when the doctor told her. Joy, pure, uncomplicated joy. For the first time in her life, she was going to be a mother. She'd told Robert on December 3rd. She'd waited until they were alone in his office, the door closed, the building quiet around them. She'd expected him to be shocked, maybe even angry, but she'd hoped, deep down, that maybe this would be the thing that finally made him leave his wife, that maybe he'd see this as a chance for them to finally have a real life together. Instead, she'd watched his face go pale, watched his hands start to shake. He'd stood up from his chair so fast it rolled backward and hit the wall. "You can't be serious," he'd said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret, you can't be pregnant. We were careful." Not careful enough, apparently. She'd tried to keep her voice steady, tried to sound confident. "Robert, I know this is unexpected, but we can figure this out. We can figure it out? How exactly do you suggest we figure this out?" His voice had risen, and Margaret had glanced nervously at the door. "I have a wife. I have grown children. I have a reputation in this town. If anyone finds out, then we'll leave," Margaret had said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "We'll go somewhere else. Start over. Robert, we could have a real life together, a real family." He'd stared at her like she was speaking a foreign language. "Leave? Margaret, I can't just leave. My whole life is here. My career, my family, everything." "What about me?" The words had come out smaller than she'd intended. "What about us? What about this baby?" Robert had sat back down, his head in his hands. When he'd finally looked up at her, his expression had been unreadable. "Give me some time to think. We'll figure something out, I promise. Just don't tell anyone yet. Please." That had been 17 days ago. Since then, Robert had been distant, cold even. He'd canceled their usual evenings together. He'd barely spoken to her except about work. And Margaret had spent those 17 days feeling her joy slowly curdle into fear. That Friday morning, Margaret worked quietly at her desk for several hours. The Christmas bonuses were always calculated based on each employee's performance and tenure, and she took the task seriously. The miners who worked underground deserved their bonuses, risking their lives daily in the dark tunnels beneath Marion County. The office staff had earned theirs too. Margaret herself would receive a modest bonus, though she always felt slightly uncomfortable accepting it. She lived simply in a small house on Adams Street, had no expensive habits, and generally saved most of her salary. Around 11:30, Robert Hills knocked on Margaret's door and stepped into her office. Several co-workers later remembered seeing him there, though none recalled anything unusual about the interaction. Through the frosted glass of her door, secretaries in the outer office could see two figures talking, but couldn't make out the words. What they couldn't see was Robert's hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. They couldn't hear him saying, "I have a solution, a way to make sure you and the baby are taken care of, no matter what happens." They couldn't see Margaret's face, cautiously hopeful, as she listened to him explain about the life insurance policy. $75,000, Robert had said, keeping his voice level and reasonable. "It'll make sure you never have to worry about money. You can leave your job, raise the baby somewhere quiet. I'll be listed as the beneficiary for now, but I'll make sure the money gets to you." We just need to keep everything quiet until the baby comes. Then we can figure out what to tell people." Margaret had wanted to believe him. She'd needed to believe him. So when he'd put the insurance papers in front of her and handed her a pen, she'd signed without reading them too carefully. Robert had always handled the financial details. She'd trusted him. What Margaret didn't know was that Robert had spent the past 17 days barely sleeping. He'd lie awake at night next to his wife, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through scenarios. Every single one ended in disaster. If the truth came out, Patricia would divorce him. His children would be humiliated. The company would fire him. He'd lose everything he'd spent 30 years building. At first, he'd thought about convincing Margaret to give the baby up for adoption. But she'd made it clear that wasn't an option. She wanted this child. She'd waited her whole life for it. Then he'd thought about paying her to leave town, to disappear and never come back. But Margaret wasn't the type to be bought off. She loved him. She thought they had a future together. That's when the other solution had started creeping into his mind. The solution he kept trying to push away, but that kept returning, more insistent each time. If Margaret simply wasn't around anymore, all his problems would disappear. No scandal, no divorce, no ruined career. His life could go back to normal. The insurance policy had been a test, in a way. If she signed it without question, if she trusted him that completely, then she wouldn't suspect anything when he asked her to meet him after work. She'd come willingly. She'd never see it coming. Robert had told himself he was just being prepared, just having options. He didn't have to go through with it. But even as he'd bought the shovel and tarp and lime from the hardware store on December 19th, even as he'd driven to the rest stop on Interstate 79 that morning to leave his own car there, even as he'd come back to work and gone through the motions of a normal day, a part of him had known. He'd already made his choice. The conversation in Margaret's office lasted 15 minutes. When Robert left, he was carrying a manila folder containing the signed insurance documents. Margaret sat at her desk for a long time after he'd gone, one hand resting on her stomach, feeling the slight roundness that was just starting to show. She'd have to get maternity clothes soon. She'd have to figure out how to tell her cousin Louise. She'd have to find a new place to live, somewhere she could raise a child. But Robert had promised to take care of her. He'd promised they'd figure it out together. She chose to believe him because the alternative, that he might abandon her, was too painful to contemplate. Margaret worked through lunch, as she often did when focused on important tasks. Her secretary, Helen Pritchard, brought her a sandwich from the deli down the street, but found it untouched on Margaret's desk 2 hours later. Helen mentioned this detail to police later, saying it was unusual because Margaret was normally very punctual about eating. She kept to strict routines. At 3 in the afternoon, Margaret made a phone call. The company switchboard operator logged it as a local number, though she didn't note which one. The call lasted 6 minutes. Years later, Detective Chen would confirm that Margaret had called her cousin Louise, telling her she might need to talk soon, that some things in her life were changing. Louise had asked if everything was okay, and Margaret had said yes, that everything was finally going to be okay. Margaret then stood up, gathered several files from her desk, and walked down the hall. But she didn't go to the records room in the basement, as witnesses would later claim. Instead, she went to the ladies' room on the 2nd floor. She stood at the sink, looking at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale. She hadn't been sleeping well, but her eyes were bright with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. She touched her stomach again, that unconscious gesture she'd developed over the past few weeks. In there, barely bigger than her fist, was a tiny person growing. Her child, Robert's child. In 6 months, she'd hold that baby in her arms. Everything else, all the difficulties and complications, would be worth it. Margaret splashed cold water on her face and dried it with a paper towel. Then she walked back to her office. Robert was standing in her doorway, waiting. "Can we talk?" he'd asked, his voice quiet. "Somewhere private?" "Of course," Margaret had said. She'd assumed he meant his office, but instead he'd said, "Let's go for a drive, get some air. We can talk without worrying about anyone overhearing." Margaret had hesitated. It was 3:15 on a Friday afternoon. She had work to finish. But Robert had looked at her with those eyes that had made her fall in love with him 6 years ago, and she'd nodded. "Just let me get my things." "Leave them," Robert had said quickly. "We'll be right back. 20 minutes. You'll be back before anyone notices." So Margaret had left her coat on the rack, left her purse in the drawer. She'd walked out of the Monongahela Coal Company building with Robert Hills for the last time, believing she'd be back in 20 minutes, believing they were finally going to figure everything out together. What actually happened next would only become clear 31 years later, pieced together from evidence and logic and the cold facts of anatomy. Robert had driven Margaret in his company car to the rest stop on Interstate 79, 40 miles south. He'd pulled into a secluded spot, away from the main parking area. He'd probably said they needed to talk seriously, somewhere nobody would interrupt them. And there, in the front seat of that car, while December light faded into winter dusk, Robert Hills had put his hands around Margaret Cashwell's throat and squeezed. She'd fought, of course. The bruising on her neck would later show that. She'd clawed at his hands, tried to push him away. But Robert was bigger, stronger, and he had the advantage of surprise. Margaret had trusted him right up until the moment he started killing her. It probably took 3 or 4 minutes. Long enough for Robert to feel her struggle weaken. Long enough for him to watch the light leave her eyes. Long enough for him to realize there was no going back now, that he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. When it was over, Robert had sat in the driver's seat. Margaret's body slumped beside him and tried to catch his breath. His hands were shaking. He'd thought he might vomit, but he'd planned this. He'd prepared. He couldn't fall apart now. He'd driven Margaret's green Ford Galaxy to the rest stop earlier that week and left it in the parking lot with the keys under the mat. Now he pulled her body from his company car and wrestled it into the trunk of her vehicle. She was heavier than he'd expected. Dead weight, he'd thought, and almost laughed at the horrible aptness of the phrase. He'd parked her car in a visible spot in the rest stop parking lot. Anyone passing would assume the driver was inside using the facilities. Then he'd carried her body into the woods, just 15 feet from the parking lot, but hidden by trees and winter darkness. The ground was cold, but not yet frozen. He'd dug the grave in under an hour, working by the light of a flashlight, his breath coming in white puffs in the December air. He'd laid Margaret in the hole, still wearing her work clothes, her turquoise bracelet and nameplate necklace, and her father's gold watch. He'd poured the lime over her body to speed decomposition, trying not to think about what he was doing, trying to see it as just a problem he was solving. Then he'd covered the grave with dirt and scattered leaves over it. His own car was parked a quarter-mile away, hidden behind a closed gas station. He'd walked to it, every step expecting someone to stop him, to ask what he was doing. But the December evening was cold and dark, and nobody was around. He'd driven back to Fairmont, arrived home at 7:30, and told Patricia he'd been working late on year-end reports. By Monday, when Margaret was reported missing, Robert had convinced himself he'd feel guilty. He'd thought remorse would hit him. But instead, what he felt was relief. The problem was solved. His life was safe. He just had to keep his nerve and act concerned. At 4:45, the company's cleaning woman, Betty Morris, came to empty the trash cans on the second floor. She noticed Margaret's office was dark and empty, but thought nothing of it. People left early on Fridays sometimes, especially before Christmas. At 5:30, Helen Pritchard was getting ready to leave for the day when she realized she hadn't seen Margaret come back upstairs. Margaret's coat was still hanging on the rack. Her purse was still in the drawer. Helen walked down to the second-floor hallway and knocked on Robert Hills's office door. He was putting papers into his briefcase, preparing to leave himself. "Have you seen Miss Cashwell?" Helen asked. "Her coat and purse are still here." Robert frowned. "She must still be in the building. Check the ladies' room?" Helen did check. Empty. She went back to Margaret's office and looked more carefully. Everything seemed normal. Margaret's desk was tidy as always, with the bonus calculations laid out in her precise handwriting. Her coffee cup sat empty on the corner of the desk. The window behind her chair was closed against the December cold. "Maybe she went out for something and forgot her coat," Robert suggested when Helen reported back. "You know how she gets when she's focused on work. She'll probably be back in a few minutes." But Margaret didn't come back. Helen waited until 6 o'clock, then went home, assuming her boss had slipped out somehow. It wasn't until Monday morning, December 23rd, when Margaret didn't show up for work, that anyone realized something was truly wrong. Helen called Margaret's home phone. No answer. She called again an hour later. Still nothing. At 10 in the morning, Helen went to Robert Hills's office. "Miss Cashwell hasn't come in," she said, "and she didn't come back Friday evening either. Her coat and purse are still here." This time Robert looked genuinely concerned. He picked up his phone and called Margaret's house himself. After letting it ring 15 times with no answer, he hung up and reached for his coat. "I'm going to her house to check on her." Robert drove to Margaret's home on Adams Street, a modest 2-bedroom house with white siding that she'd bought in 1960. The house looked quiet, with all the curtains drawn. No car in the driveway. Robert knocked on the front door repeatedly. No response. He tried the door and found it locked. He walked around the house, peering in windows, but couldn't see anything unusual. Everything looked orderly and normal. Growing more worried, Robert went to the house next door and knocked. An elderly woman named Doris Campbell answered. Robert explained the situation and asked if she'd seen Margaret over the weekend. Doris thought carefully before answering. "You know, I did see her Friday evening, around 5:30, maybe 6 o'clock, but it wasn't her car. It was a dark sedan, couldn't tell you the make. It pulled into her driveway and sat there for a few minutes with the engine running. I remember because it seemed odd. Margaret always drove that green Ford of hers." "Did you see who was driving?" "No, I didn't go to the window in time, but after a few minutes the car backed out and drove away. I assumed it was someone dropping her off. Maybe her car had trouble, but I never saw her again after that." Doris paused, her weathered face troubled. "There was something else, too. About 2 weeks ago, I saw Margaret sitting in her car in the driveway late at night, just sitting there in the dark with the engine off. I waved, but she didn't see me. She looked like she was crying. I meant to ask her if everything was okay, but I never got the chance." This information troubled Robert deeply, though he hid it well. If Doris had seen a dark sedan, if someone had been at Margaret's house Friday evening, it complicated things. But it also potentially gave him an alibi. Someone else had been the last to see Margaret. He thanked Mrs. Campbell and drove back to the Monongahela building. Detective Frank Russo of the Fairmont Police Department arrived at the company headquarters at 1:30 that afternoon. He was 46 years old, a veteran of the department who'd handled everything from theft to the occasional murder during his 20 years on the force. He took the case seriously from the start. A woman missing without her purse or coat in December was cause for immediate concern. Russo interviewed everyone who'd been in the building on Friday. The story that emerged was consistent. Margaret had worked normally until mid-afternoon, gone down to the records room, and then seemingly vanished. Her car was gone from the office parking lot, but her personal belongings remained at her desk. Nobody had seen her leave the building. Could she have left through a different exit? Russo asked Robert Hills. Maybe a back door or side entrance. It's possible, Robert admitted. We have 3 exits. The main entrance in front, a side door that leads to the parking lot, and a back door by the loading dock. But why would she leave without her coat? It was 32 degrees Friday evening. Russo went to Margaret's house with a warrant. Using the key provided by the landlord, he entered the small home and conducted a thorough search. Everything appeared normal and undisturbed. The kitchen was clean, the bed was neatly made. Margaret's clothes hung in the closet, organized by color. Her bathroom contained the usual toiletries. Nothing seemed to be missing except Margaret herself. The detective found her checkbook in a drawer in the kitchen. The last entry showed a balance of $1,243.60. He found her passport in a box in the bedroom closet, which ruled out the theory that she'd suddenly left the country. He found a calendar on the wall with various appointments marked down, including one that said, "Christmas dinner at Louise's for December 25th. Louise turned out to be Margaret's second cousin in Clarksburg, the only family member she regularly kept in contact with. Russo called Louise Brenner. She said she'd invited Margaret for Christmas dinner weeks ago, and Margaret had accepted. She was looking forward to it, Louise told the detective, her voice thick with worry. She even asked what she could bring. We decided on a green bean casserole. But, detective, there's something else. Margaret called me last Friday, around 3 in the afternoon. She said she needed to talk to me soon, that some things in her life were changing. She sounded happy, but also scared, if that makes sense. Like something big was happening, but she wasn't sure how to feel about it. Did she say what was changing? No, I asked her, but she said she couldn't talk about it yet. She said she'd tell me everything soon, maybe at Christmas dinner. I told her I was here if she needed anything, and she said she knew. She said, Louise's voice broke. She said, "You've always been good to me, Louise. Thank you for not judging me." What did she mean by that? What was happening to her? Russo had no answer, but that phone call suggested Margaret had been planning to reveal something significant, something that made her worry about being judged. It added another layer of mystery to her disappearance. The police put out a bulletin for Margaret's car, a 1966 green Ford Galaxy. They searched the roads around Fairmont, checked with hospitals in the area, and contacted police departments in neighboring counties. No sign of the vehicle or its driver. Margaret Cashwell had seemingly vanished into thin air on a cold December evening. Detective Russo expanded his investigation. He interviewed Margaret's neighbors, who all described her as quiet, reliable, and private. She kept her lawn neat, paid her bills on time, and didn't cause any trouble. She attended the Methodist church on Sunday mornings, but didn't socialize much afterward. She had no close friends, no romantic interests that anyone knew of. Her life revolved around her work. Did she seem worried about anything recently? Russo asked the neighbors. Doris Campbell from next door thought about it. Now that you mention it, she did seem different the last few weeks. More distracted, but also lighter somehow, if that makes sense. Like she had a secret that made her happy. I saw her touching her stomach once or twice when she thought nobody was watching. My daughter used to do that when she was expecting. Detective, I don't want to speak out of turn, but could Margaret have been pregnant? The question hit Russo like a physical blow. A 42-year-old unmarried woman, pregnant in 1968? That would explain so much. The secretiveness, the worry mixed with happiness, the need to talk to her cousin. If Margaret had been pregnant, where was the father? And what had he thought about it? The police interviewed Margaret's co-workers more extensively. Most described her as competent, professional, and somewhat stern. She wasn't the type to joke around in the break room or join after-work social gatherings. She focused on her job and did it exceptionally well. Several people mentioned that she'd seemed quieter than usual in recent weeks, but nobody had thought much of it at the time. Helen Pritchard, her secretary, provided the most detailed information. Miss Cashwell was definitely worried about something in early December, Helen told Detective Russo. She kept rechecking figures, going back over old ledgers. She stayed late several nights, which wasn't like her at all. She always left at 5 o'clock exactly. But that first week of December, she didn't leave until 7 or 8 some nights. "Did she tell you what she was working on?" Russo asked. "No, sir. Miss Cashwell was very private about company finances. She said it wouldn't be professional to discuss such matters with support staff." Helen hesitated, then continued. "But there was something else. Miss Cashwell started wearing looser clothing in November. She'd been so careful about her appearance before, always professional and fitted. But suddenly she was wearing sweaters that hung loose, skirts with elastic waists. And she stopped drinking coffee. She used to have 3 cups a day, like clockwork. Then one day in November she poured herself a cup, took 1 sip, and turned green. She never touched coffee again after that." Russo leaned forward. "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Pritchard?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Detective. I'm telling you what I observed. My sister had 4 children. I know what morning sickness looks like. I know what a woman does when she's trying to hide a pregnancy." Helen's eyes filled with tears. If Miss Cashwell was expecting, she must have been terrified. An unmarried woman in her 40s? That would have destroyed her reputation. She'd worked so hard to get where she was. Russo interviewed Robert Hills multiple times. The CFO maintained that everything had been normal at work. Yes, Margaret had been preparing the Christmas bonuses. Yes, she'd come to his office Friday morning to discuss some calculations. No, there hadn't been any problems. No disagreements, no concerns about her work, nothing unusual whatsoever. "What was your relationship with Miss Cashwell?" Russo asked during the 3rd interview. Robert's face remained carefully neutral. "Professional, she reported to me. She was an excellent accountant. That's all. Some of her co-workers suggested you were close. We worked together for 14 years, Detective. Of course we were cordial, but if you're implying something improper, I can assure you that's not the case. I'm a married man. I have children. My reputation is unblemished." Russo studied Robert carefully. The man seemed calm, almost too calm for someone whose colleague had vanished. "Can you think of any reason she might leave town?" Robert considered this, taking his time with the answer. "Margaret used to talk about retiring to Florida someday. She mentioned it several times over the years. Warm weather, ocean views, that sort of thing. But she was only 42. Too young to retire, and she loved her work. I can't imagine her just leaving without notice." He paused. "Unless something had happened that made staying impossible." "Like what?" "I couldn't say, Detective. Margaret was private about her personal life. Perhaps she'd gotten herself into some kind of trouble. Women do, sometimes, when they're lonely." The implication was clear, though Robert never said it directly. He was planting the idea that Margaret might have been involved with someone, might have had personal problems that led her to disappear. It was a clever misdirection, and Russo noted it in his report. But without evidence, there was nothing he could do except continue searching for Margaret. The police checked with Florida authorities anyway. No sign of Margaret Cashwell registering anywhere, no credit card usage, no trail at all. It was as if she'd driven away from Fairmont and disappeared completely. 3 days after Margaret's disappearance, on Christmas Eve, a state trooper found her green Ford Galaxy. It was parked at a rest stop on Interstate 79, about 40 miles south of Fairmont. The car was locked and appeared undamaged. When police opened it, they found nothing unusual inside. The gas tank was half full. Margaret's registration and insurance papers were in the glove box. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened to the driver. The rest stop where the car was found was a common stopping point for people traveling through West Virginia. It had restrooms, vending machines, and picnic tables. The state trooper who discovered the vehicle said it had probably been there for several days, though he couldn't be certain. Nobody working at the rest stop remembered seeing a middle-aged woman in a business suit. Detective Russo had the car towed to the police impound lot and went over it thoroughly. He dusted for fingerprints and found only Margaret's. He checked the trunk and found nothing but a spare tire and a jack. He examined the upholstery for any signs of violence. Nothing. The car told him absolutely nothing about where Margaret had gone or what had happened to her. The case frustrated Russo deeply. He'd handled plenty of missing persons cases, but they usually had some logic to them. Runaways left notes. Victims of foul play left evidence. People who wanted to disappear took their belongings with them. But Margaret had left her purse and coat, driven 40 miles south, abandoned her car at a rest stop, and then vanished. It made no sense. The police continued investigating through January and February of 1969. They interviewed hundreds of people. They checked every hospital, morgue, and Jane Doe in 3 states. They searched the woods around the rest stop with dogs and found nothing. Margaret's face appeared in newspapers across West Virginia and in neighboring states. Tips came in, but none led anywhere. Someone thought they'd seen her at a bus station in Pittsburgh. Someone else claimed she was working as a waitress in Ohio. All false leads. The Monongahela Coal Company posted a $5,000 reward for information leading to Margaret's whereabouts. Robert Hills appeared on local television, appealing for anyone with knowledge to come forward. "Margaret was a valued employee and a good person," he said into the cameras. "If anyone knows anything, please contact the police. Her family deserves answers." But the answers never came. Spring arrived, then summer. The case gradually moved from active investigation to cold status. Detective Russo kept the file on his desk for another year, occasionally following up on new tips, but by 1970 even he had to admit defeat. Margaret Cashwell had joined the ranks of people who simply disappeared without explanation. The prevailing theory, such as it was, held that Margaret had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Perhaps the stress of her job had become too much. Perhaps she'd been dealing with depression that nobody knew about. She'd driven to the rest stop, walked away into the woods, and succumbed to exposure. Or maybe she'd hitched a ride with a trucker and started a new life somewhere far away. The latter seemed unlikely given that she'd left without money or identification, but people had done stranger things. Robert Hills retired from the Monongahela Coal Company in 1974. He moved to North Carolina with his wife and rarely spoke about his former colleague's disappearance. The company promoted someone else to Margaret's position. Helen Pritchard continued working there until her own retirement in 1981. The building got new carpet and fresh paint. Life went on. Margaret's house on Adams Street was eventually sold by the county after years of unpaid taxes. Her belongings were auctioned off. Her second cousin Louise died in 1976, taking with her the last personal connection to the missing woman. By 1980, most people in Fairmont had forgotten about Margaret Cashwell entirely. She became just another old mystery, the kind of story that occasionally came up at dinner parties when conversation turned to local legends. Detective Frank Russo retired in 1985 after a heart attack. Before he left the department, he boxed up all his old case files, including Margaret's. He wrote a note on the outside of the box. "Never solved this one. Someone got away with something." But even Russo didn't know what that something was. He died in 1992, taking his suspicions to the grave. The Monongahela Coal Company continued operating through the 1980s and 1990s, though the coal industry in West Virginia was in slow decline. Foreign competition, environmental regulations, and changing energy markets all took their toll. The company downsized repeatedly. By 1998, only 80 employees remained, and the headquarters building on the edge of downtown was looking shabby and outdated. In 1999, the company finally filed for bankruptcy. It was a sad end for an operation that had once employed hundreds and powered much of West Virginia's economy. The bankruptcy proceedings were complex, involving creditors, employee pensions, and environmental cleanup obligations. One of the creditors was Guardian Life Insurance Company, which had provided life insurance policies for the company's executives going back to the 1950s. Guardian Life had changed considerably over the decades. In 1999, the company was in the process of digitizing all their old paper records, transferring millions of documents into electronic databases. It was a massive undertaking that required dozens of employees to scan, verify, and input data from policy documents that in some cases dated back to the 1920s. One of these employees was Cynthia Marlowe, a 34-year-old auditor working in Guardian Life's Pittsburgh office. Cynthia's job was to review old policies, verify that death benefits had been properly paid, and flag any irregularities for further investigation. It was tedious work, but Cynthia was detail-oriented and actually enjoyed the puzzle aspect of tracking down old paperwork. In November 1999, Cynthia was reviewing a batch of policies from the 1960s related to the Monongahela Coal Company bankruptcy. Most were straightforward. Company presidents, vice presidents, and senior executives had all carried life insurance policies as part of their compensation packages. Most had died of natural causes over the years, and their beneficiaries had received the appropriate payouts. But one policy caught Cynthia's attention. It was for Margaret Cashwell, listed as senior accountant. The policy had been issued on December 13, 1968, with a death benefit of $75,000. The policy was unusual for several reasons. First, $75,000 was an enormous death benefit for 1968, especially for someone in Margaret's position. The company president's policy at that time was only $50,000. Second, Margaret wasn't listed as an executive. Normally, these large policies were reserved for top management. Third, and most oddly, the beneficiary wasn't a family member. Instead, the beneficiary was listed as Robert T. Hills, Chief Financial Officer. Something about this struck Cynthia as wrong. Why would a middle-aged accountant have her boss listed as the beneficiary on such a large policy? It made no sense. Family members were beneficiaries. Spouses, children, siblings, not colleagues, not supervisors. Cynthia did what any curious person in 1999 would do. She typed Margaret Cashwell and Monongahela Coal into an internet search engine. Within seconds, she had her answer. Dozens of newspaper articles from December 1968 and early 1969 appeared on her screen. Local accountant vanishes. Police search for missing woman. Margaret Cashwell disappearance remains mystery. Cynthia clicked through article after article, piecing together the story. Margaret Cashwell had disappeared on December 20th, 1968, just 7 days after this insurance policy had been issued. Her car had been found abandoned at a rest stop. She'd left behind her coat and purse at work. No trace of her had ever been found. Cynthia pulled up the rest of the Guardian Life file. 3 days after Margaret was reported missing on December 26, 1968, Robert Hills had filed a death claim. The claim was denied. Guardian Life's records showed extensive correspondence with Mr. Hills throughout 1969 and 1970. He'd insisted that Margaret must be dead, that she would never have disappeared voluntarily, that the death benefit should be paid. Guardian Life had refused, citing the fact that no body had been found and no death certificate had been issued. Eventually, Robert Hills had given up pursuing the claim, and the policy had lapsed into dormancy. Cynthia sat back in her chair and stared at the computer screen. The timeline was damning. Policy issued December 13th. Woman disappears December 20th. Beneficiary files death claim December 26th. 7 days, then 7 days. It was too convenient, too calculated. This wasn't coincidence. This was murder. Cynthia pulled every document she could find related to the policy. The application had been filled out on December 11th, 1968, and rushed through processing. Someone had marked it urgent and pushed it through in just 2 days, which was extremely fast for that era. The signature on the application was Margaret Cashwell's, though Cynthia had no way to verify if it was genuine. The beneficiary designation was clear. Robert T. Hills, relationship listed as colleague. The more Cynthia looked at it, the more suspicious it appeared. She'd worked in insurance long enough to recognize patterns that didn't fit. A woman takes out a massive life insurance policy naming her married boss as beneficiary, then disappears a week later, and that same boss immediately files for the death benefit? This one screamed murder. But it was a 31-year-old case involving a missing person. What could she possibly do about it now? Cynthia discussed it with her supervisor, who agreed it looked questionable. They decided to report it to the appropriate authorities. The question was, which authorities? Guardian Life was based in Pittsburgh, but the disappearance had occurred in Fairmont, West Virginia. After some deliberation, they decided to contact the West Virginia State Police. On November 18, 1999, Detective Sarah Chen of the West Virginia State Police received a phone call from Guardian Life Insurance Company. The auditor on the phone explained the situation with the old insurance policy. Detective Chen listened carefully, taking notes. When the call ended, she sat quietly for a moment, thinking. Sarah Chen was 39 years old, one of the first women to rise to detective rank in the West Virginia State Police. She'd built her reputation on cold cases, taking old unsolved mysteries and applying modern investigative techniques. She'd cleared 3 murder cases from the 1970s using DNA evidence and had earned respect throughout the department for her methodical approach. This case intrigued her immediately. A missing woman, a suspicious insurance policy, a beneficiary who'd filed a claim 3 days after the disappearance. It had all the hallmarks of murder, but 3 decades had passed. Still, Chen believed that old cases deserved new eyes. She requested the complete file on Margaret Cashwell. The file arrived 2 days later, a dusty cardboard box containing everything the Fairmont Police Department had collected in 1968 and 1969. Chen spent an entire weekend reading through witness statements, police reports, and photographs. She studied the timeline carefully. She examined the photos of Margaret's abandoned car. She read Detective Russo's notes, including his final assessment. Never solved this one. Someone got away with something. On Monday morning, Chen made her first call. She contacted the insurance company and requested copies of every document related to the policy. She wanted to see Margaret's signature on the application. She wanted to know who'd processed it. She wanted every detail Guardian Life could provide. While waiting for those documents, Chen began tracking down people who'd known Margaret Cashwell. Most were dead or impossible to locate after 31 years. But she found Helen Pritchard, Margaret's former secretary, living in a nursing home in Morgantown. Helen was 83 years old now, but her memory was sharp. "I remember Miss Cashwell very well," Helen told Chen during their phone conversation. "She was a good boss, fair, professional. She treated me with respect, which wasn't common back then." Did you ever notice anything unusual about her relationship with Robert Hills? Chen asked. There was a long pause on the line. Then Helen spoke carefully. I shouldn't speak ill of the dead. Margaret is dead? No, I meant Mr. Hills. He passed away 5 years ago. Cancer. But to answer your question, yes, I noticed something. I think they were involved. Chen sat up straighter in her chair. Involved romantically? I can't prove it, Helen said. Miss Cashwell was very private, but I worked for her for 8 years, and I saw things. The way Mr. Hills looked at her sometimes. The way they'd both stay late at the office on the same nights. One time I came back to get my purse after I'd left for the day, and I saw them in her office. They were just talking, nothing improper. But the door was closed, and they were standing very close together. When I knocked, they both jumped apart like I'd caught them doing something wrong. When was this? Oh, this was years before she disappeared. Maybe 1965 or 1966. I always suspected they had something going on, but I never said anything. It wasn't my business, and besides, Mr. Hills was married. I didn't want to cause trouble. Did you notice anything different about their relationship in the weeks before Margaret disappeared? Helen thought about this. Actually, yes. In November and early December of 1968, Miss Cashwell seemed upset. She was distracted, like I told the police back then, and Mr. Hills seemed tense around her. I remember one day in early December I heard them arguing in his office. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone. It was the only time I ever heard Miss Cashwell raise her voice at work. Do you remember what day this was? I'm sorry, dear. That's too long ago. But it was definitely in early December, maybe a week or two before she vanished. Chen thanked Helen and hung up. She sat thinking about this new information. An affair between Margaret and Robert, an argument in early December, Margaret's disappearance on December 20th, and a $75,000 life insurance policy issued on December 13th, right in the middle of whatever was happening between them. Chen drove to North Carolina to interview Robert Hills's widow. Patricia Hills was 78 years old, living alone in a condominium in Raleigh. She was a small woman with white hair and intelligent eyes. She agreed to speak with Chen, but seemed wary. I don't know what I can tell you about Margaret Cashwell, Patricia said as they sat in her tidy living room. I barely knew the woman. She worked with Robert, that's all. Mrs. Hills, I'm going to be direct with you. Did you know your husband was having an affair with Margaret Cashwell? Patricia's face hardened. Is that what this is about? You want to dig up ancient history and ruin my memories of my husband? Robert is dead, Detective. He died in 1994. Let him rest in peace. I'm investigating a possible murder, Mrs. Hills. I need to know the truth. Patricia stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below. She was silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight with old anger. Yes, I knew. I found out in 1970, after Margaret had been gone for over a year. I was going through some papers in Robert's desk at home, looking for our tax documents, and I found letters. Love letters from her to him. They'd been having an affair for years, apparently, since the early 1960s. How did you react when you found out? I was devastated. We had 2 children. We'd been married for 28 years. I confronted Robert. He admitted everything. He said the affair had ended when Margaret disappeared, that he didn't know where she'd gone, that he regretted everything. He begged me not to leave him. And you stayed? Yes, I stayed. It was 1970, Detective. I was 50 years old with no job skills. Divorce was still shameful. I made him promise never to contact her again if she ever surfaced, and I tried to move on. We moved to North Carolina in 1974 to make a fresh start. Did Robert ever talk about what happened to Margaret? Patricia turned from the window to face Chen. He said he had no idea. He said she just left one day without explanation, but I never quite believed him. Why not? Because he was too calm about it. When someone you supposedly loved disappears without a trace, you should be frantic. You should be searching everywhere, calling police departments, hiring private detectives. But Robert just accepted it. He mourned for a few weeks and then moved on with his life. It always struck me as wrong, like he knew something he wasn't saying. Chen leaned forward. Mrs. Hills, do you think your husband killed Margaret Cashwell? Patricia sat back down slowly. She looked at her hands, folded in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I've thought about it for 30 years. After I found those letters, I wondered. But I could never bring myself to believe that Robert was capable of murder. He was a good father. He was respected in his profession. He went to church every Sunday. How could someone like that kill another person? So I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself Margaret had just left town and Robert was telling the truth. But you had doubts. Yes, I had doubts. There was something else too, something I found in his papers that I never understood. What was that? A receipt from a hardware store in Fairmont, dated December 19th, 1968, the day before Margaret disappeared. Robert had bought a shovel, a tarp, and 50 pounds of lime. When I asked him about it years later, he said he couldn't remember. He said he must have been doing some work around the house. But we lived in a nice neighborhood, detective. We paid people to do yard work. Robert never did manual labor. And 50 pounds of lime? What would he need that for? Chen felt her pulse quicken. Lime was commonly used to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell of a corpse. Do you still have that receipt? No, I threw it away decades ago. I didn't want to keep thinking about what it might mean. Mrs. Hills, did your husband ever mention taking out a life insurance policy on Margaret? Patricia looked surprised. Is that what this is about? The insurance policy? Yes, I knew about it. That's actually why Robert could never collect. The insurance company refused to pay without a death certificate. Robert was furious about it for years. He said he'd taken out the policy to protect Margaret's interests, that she'd asked him to be the beneficiary because she had no family. But I always thought it was suspicious. Why would she ask her married lover to be her beneficiary? It made no sense unless they were planning something together. Or unless he was planning something alone, Chen said quietly. Patricia met Chen's eyes. You think he killed her for the insurance money? I think it's possible. $75,000 was a lot of money in 1968. But he never got the money, so what would be the point? Maybe things didn't go according to plan, Chen said. Maybe he thought the insurance company would pay out more easily. Or maybe there was another reason entirely. Chen left North Carolina with more questions than answers. She drove back to West Virginia and began digging deeper into Robert Hills's life in 1968. She pulled his financial records from that period. She found nothing unusual, no large debts, no financial problems, nothing that would explain why he'd need $75,000 so desperately that he'd commit murder. She examined the hardware store receipt that Patricia had mentioned. The store had closed in 1982, and their records were long gone. But Chen found the store's location on an old map. It was 3 blocks from the Monongahela Coal Company headquarters. Robert had bought those items the day before Margaret disappeared. Chen obtained a warrant to search the property where Robert and Patricia Hills had lived in 1968. The house had changed hands 3 times since then, but it was still standing. The current owners were cooperative. Chen brought in a cadaver dog team to search the yard. The dogs alerted on a spot near the back fence, but ground-penetrating radar showed nothing unusual. If something had been buried there, it was gone now. Chen tracked down everyone who'd worked at Monongahela Coal in December 1968. Most were dead. A few had moved away and couldn't be located. But she found Thomas Fletcher, the records room clerk, in a veterans' nursing home. He was 93 years old and suffering from dementia. He couldn't remember much about Margaret Cashwell. She found Betty Morris, the cleaning woman, living in Fairmont. Betty was 86 now and walked with a cane. She remembered the case vaguely, but had nothing new to offer. Chen felt the investigation stalling. Everything pointed to Robert Hills, but he was dead. Without a body, without physical evidence, without witnesses who could place Robert with Margaret after she left work on December 20th, 1968, Chen had nothing that would hold up in court. Even if Robert were still alive, she couldn't prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Then, in January 2000, Chen got a call from an unexpected source. The West Virginia Department of Transportation was conducting a survey for a highway expansion project on Interstate 79, the same highway where Margaret's car had been found. They were using ground-penetrating radar to assess the terrain, and they'd discovered something unusual buried about 15 feet from the rest stop parking lot just inside the tree line. Chen drove to the site immediately. A team of forensic archaeologists had been brought in. They worked carefully, excavating a rectangular area about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. 8 feet down, they found bones. The skeleton was mostly intact, lying in what had once been a shallow grave. Time and root growth had disturbed some of the smaller bones, but the skull was there. So was jewelry, a small gold watch, a bracelet with turquoise stones, and wrapped around the skeletal neck, a necklace with a nameplate that read Margaret. Helen Pritchard, when shown a photograph of the jewelry, confirmed it through her tears. "That's Miss Cashwell's watch. She wore it every day. Her father gave it to her when she graduated from business school. She was so proud of it. She said it reminded her that she'd earned her place in the world." The forensic anthropologist determined that the skeleton was female, approximately 40 to 45 years old at time of death, height and build, consistent with Margaret Cashwell's description. Dental records confirmed it. This was Margaret Cashwell, buried in a makeshift grave within sight of where her car had been abandoned. The autopsy revealed more. The hyoid bone in Margaret's neck was fractured, indicating she'd been strangled. The break pattern suggested manual strangulation, someone's hands around her throat, squeezing until she stopped breathing. It would have taken several minutes. Margaret would have been conscious for most of it, fighting, unable to breathe, looking into the eyes of the person killing her. And inside the pelvic cavity, the anthropologist found something that made Chen close her eyes in sorrow. Tiny fetal bones, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, delicate as bird bones. A skull no bigger than a walnut. Margaret had been pregnant when she died, approximately 12 to 14 weeks along. Chen looked at those tiny bones for a long time. This was what had died with Margaret that December evening. Not just a woman, but the future she'd dreamed of. The baby she'd wanted so desperately. The family she'd never had. All of it strangled and buried in the cold ground because someone had decided his comfort was more important than their lives. Chen sat in her office that night, staring at the autopsy report. Now everything made sense. The affair, the tension in early December, the argument Helen had overheard. Margaret had been pregnant with Robert Hills's child. She'd probably told him about it in early December, maybe even asked him to leave his wife. Robert had panicked. He couldn't let his wife find out. He couldn't let the company find out. In 1968, an affair with a subordinate would have destroyed his career. A pregnancy would have ruined his marriage and his reputation. So he'd made a plan. He'd taken out the insurance policy, making himself the beneficiary. He'd told Margaret it was to secure her future and the baby's future, She'd trusted him. She'd signed the papers. Then, on December 19th, he'd bought the shovel, tarp, and lime. On December 20th, he'd convinced Margaret to leave work early, to meet him somewhere. Maybe he'd said they needed to talk about the baby. Maybe he'd promised they'd figure out a solution together. She'd left her coat and purse behind because she thought she'd be right back. But Robert had driven her to the rest stop on Interstate 79. He'd parked her car there to make it look like she'd left town. Then he'd strangled her. He'd buried her body in the woods nearby. He'd used the lime to accelerate decomposition and mask the smell. Then he'd driven back to Fairmont in his own car, which he must have left near the rest stop earlier. It was a calculated murder, premeditated, cold-blooded, and it had almost worked. If not for a routine insurance audit 31 years later, Robert Hills would have taken his secret to the grave. Chen spent the next 2 months building a posthumous case. She couldn't prosecute a dead man, but she could close the investigation and give Margaret's few remaining relatives some answers. She interviewed everyone again. She documented every piece of evidence. She wrote a comprehensive report detailing exactly how and why Robert Hills had murdered Margaret Cashwell. In March 2000, the West Virginia State Police held a press conference. Detective Sarah Chen stood at a podium in front of television cameras and announced that the 31-year-old disappearance of Margaret Cashwell had been solved. Margaret had been murdered by Robert T. Hills, her supervisor and secret lover, because she was pregnant with his child, and he wanted to preserve his marriage and career. The story made national news. A cold case solved through an insurance audit. A woman murdered by the man she loved. A baby who never got the chance to be born. Patricia Hills released a statement through her lawyer. "I am devastated to learn the truth about my late husband. I cannot reconcile the man I knew with the man who could commit such a horrible act. My heart breaks for Margaret Cashwell and her unborn child. They deserved so much better." Helen Pritchard, interviewed by a local television station, wept openly. "Miss Cashwell was a good person. She worked so hard. She was so proud of that job. I knew something bad had happened to her. I'm glad the truth finally came out, even if it took 31 years. The Monongahela Coal Company was long defunct by then, but former employees who'd known Margaret held a memorial service for her in Fairmont. About 30 people attended, most of them elderly. They shared memories of a professional, competent woman who'd been good at her job and kind to her co-workers. They mourned not just for Margaret, but for the child she'd been carrying, the family she'd never gotten to have. Helen Pritchard spoke at the service, her voice shaking. "Miss Cashwell wanted a family so badly. I saw it in her eyes whenever someone brought their children to the office. She'd smile at them, and her whole face would light up. She would have been a good mother. She deserved that chance. They both deserved that chance." She looked at the simple casket containing Margaret's remains. "I'm sorry we didn't protect you, Miss Cashwell. I'm sorry we didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry Robert made you believe he loved you when all he cared about was himself." Margaret was buried properly this time in a cemetery in Fairmont overlooking the Monongahela River. Her headstone read, "Margaret Cashwell, 1926-1968, and her unborn child, beloved daughter and friend, justice delayed but not denied." Louise Brenner's daughter, Margaret's second cousin once removed, was the only family member left to mourn. She attended the funeral and burial. Afterward, she told reporters, "Aunt Margaret was always so independent. She worked in a man's world and held her own. She didn't deserve to die because she loved the wrong person and dared to want a family. I'm glad she can finally rest in peace. I'm glad someone cared enough to find the truth." Detective Sarah Chen attended the burial. She stood at the back of the small crowd, watching as Margaret's remains were lowered into the ground beside a second tiny casket containing the fetal remains. The priest said something about mercy and forgiveness, but Chen wasn't listening. She was thinking about the 12 to 14 weeks Margaret had carried that pregnancy, believing she was finally going to have the family she'd wanted. Thinking about how she'd signed those insurance papers, trusting the man she loved to take care of her. Thinking about those last moments in the car when Margaret must have realized Robert wasn't going to help her, that he was going to kill her instead. After the ceremony, Chen walked to her car. She thought about Robert Hills, who'd lived another 26 years after murdering Margaret. He'd raised his children, advanced in his career, retired comfortably to North Carolina, and died of natural causes at age 73. He'd never faced justice in a courtroom. He'd never spent a day in prison. He'd gotten away with it, in a sense. But Chen wondered what those 26 years had been like for him. Did he think about Margaret? Did he see her face when he closed his eyes at night? Did he think about the child he'd killed, the son or daughter who would have been his? Did he attend church on Sundays and pray for forgiveness, or did he convince himself he'd done what was necessary? Patricia Hills had told Chen something during their last conversation after the body had been found. Robert had nightmares in the 1970s, she'd said quietly. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, gasping for air. He'd sit on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands, and I'd ask what was wrong. He always said it was work stress. But one night, about 5 years after Margaret disappeared, he said something strange. He said, "She trusted me, and I broke that trust." I asked who he meant, but he wouldn't answer. He just kept saying, "She trusted me." I didn't understand it then. Now I do. Chen thought about that, about trust and betrayal, about a man who wasn't a monster, just someone who'd made a terrible choice when faced with a problem he didn't want to deal with. Robert Hills had probably loved Margaret in his way, but when she'd become inconvenient, when keeping her alive threatened everything he valued, he'd chosen himself. That was the heart of it. When it came down to it, he'd decided his comfortable life mattered more than her life and their child's life. The insurance policy, the piece of evidence that had finally broken the case open, was placed in the state police archives. Guardian Life Insurance Company had long since written off the $75,000 as a bad policy. They'd never paid the claim, and now they never would. The company donated an equivalent amount to a charity supporting single mothers and their children, saying it was what Margaret would have wanted. Cynthia Marlowe, the auditor who'd noticed the irregularity in the first place, was recognized by the West Virginia State Police for her role in solving the case. She was invited to the press conference and thanked personally by Detective Chen. Cynthia, uncomfortable with the attention, simply said she'd been doing her job. "I just thought something didn't look right," Cynthia told reporters. "The timeline was too convenient. A policy issued, a woman disappearing, a claim filed so quickly. It felt wrong. I'm glad I called it in. Nobody should get away with murder, even if it takes 31 years to prove it." The case of Margaret Cashwell became a teaching example in cold case investigation courses. It demonstrated how seemingly unrelated pieces of information, a routine insurance audit, old newspaper articles, and patient detective work could combine to solve even the oldest mysteries. It showed that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still arrive. For the people who'd known Margaret in 1968, the resolution was bittersweet. She was dead, and had been dead all along, but at least now they knew what had happened. At least she'd been found and properly buried. At least her killer had been identified, even if he'd escaped earthly justice. The Monongahela Coal Company building was demolished in 2002. The 3-story brick structure where Margaret had worked for 14 years was torn down to make way for a parking lot. But before it was demolished, someone placed a small plaque near the entrance. It read, "In memory of Margaret Cashwell, who worked here 1954-1968. A dedicated professional whose life was cut short by violence. Never forgotten." The plaque stayed there for 2 months before the demolition crew took it down, but someone photographed it first, and the image spread online. People who'd never known Margaret, who'd never heard of Fairmont or Monongahela Coal, saw that plaque and learned her story. They learned about a woman who'd worked hard, loved unwisely, and died because she'd trusted the wrong person. Detective Sarah Chen kept a photograph on her desk for the rest of her career. It showed Margaret Cashwell in 1966, standing in front of the Monongahela Coal Building. She was wearing a dark suit and holding a briefcase, looking every inch the professional businesswoman she'd worked so hard to become. Her expression was serious, but her eyes held a hint of satisfaction. She'd earned her place in that building. She'd proven herself in a world that didn't welcome women easily. Chen looked at that photograph whenever she felt discouraged about a case. It reminded her why she did this work. Because people like Margaret Cashwell deserved justice. Because even when the killer was dead and the trail was cold and 3 decades had passed, the truth still mattered. Because families deserved answers and victims deserved to be remembered. But the photograph also reminded Chen of something else. Margaret hadn't just been a victim. She'd been a woman who'd built a career against incredible odds. She'd been someone who'd loved deeply, even if she'd loved unwisely. She'd been brave enough to want a child at 42 in an era when that choice would have destroyed her professionally. She'd been willing to risk everything for a chance at the family she'd always wanted. That courage deserved to be remembered alongside the tragedy. Margaret Cashwell hadn't just been murdered. She'd lived, she'd worked, she'd dreamed. She'd felt joy when she learned she was pregnant. She'd believed in a future that never came. Those things mattered just as much as how she died. In the end, that's what Margaret got. Not the life she'd hoped for, not the family she'd wanted, not the future she'd deserved. But she got the truth. She got justice, delayed but real. And she got people who remembered her not just as a victim, but as a person. A woman who'd worked hard, lived independently, and loved deeply even when that love destroyed her. The case became a teaching example in law enforcement academies, not just because of how it was solved, but because of what it represented. It showed how someone could appear respectable, could have a family and a career and a position in the community, and still be capable of murder when their comfortable life was threatened. It showed how victims weren't always innocent children or blameless strangers, but sometimes were women who'd made choices that society judged harshly, who'd loved men they shouldn't have loved, who'd wanted things they weren't supposed to want. It showed that justice, while imperfect and often late, was still worth pursuing, that the truth mattered even 3 decades later, that the dead deserved voices, even when those voices took years to speak. Margaret Cashwell and her unborn child had been silent in their grave for 31 years, but in the end, they spoke, and people listened, and that had to count for something.